All right, I think we're ready. Good morning.
Good morning. So today is kind of our first, I don't know, real topic since we've transitioned to doing this in sign language. And I'm feeling a little like, ugh, like, what are we going to talk about? My hands don't work all of a sudden.
I know, right?
Because we typically do, talk about CODA stuff in English.
Yeah,
And so now my mind is working really hard to like get in the right headspace. I don't know. Are you feeling the same way? But
totally. Totally.
okay.
You know what, though? I think it's really interesting because I feel that whenever I talk about CODA stuff in ASL, that's when I feel away. Other topics, I'm totally fine using ASL, but CODA stuff, I have emotions around it. So the question becomes, why? I think it's because, like what we talked about last week, is we are conditioned to keep our CODA parts to ourselves. So our CODA stories are really conditioned to us to not share. And that's something that we talk about amongst other hearing CODAs.
Well, and I also do wonder, like, is English a
Oh,
non-emotional language
my
for
God.
us? And ASL is more of my emotional language, right? So
Yes.
when I talk about things in English, I can talk about it without any emotions, without any feeling.
Ugh.
But in ASL, oh my God, all the
Ooh.
feels. And so now I'm like, whoa, all the feelings.
Yes, you feel so raw.
Exactly, raw. Anyway, well, so you and I were talking about, well, what are we going to talk about today? And you had mentioned several weeks ago that you wanted to talk about the current war
Just
that's
to,
happening in Israel
yeah, to
and
acknowledge it.
Palestine.
Yeah.
Right, right. And what's happening with the Jewish community. And it was like, oh boy. At the time, the war had just broke out, and it felt very big, right? Like a very big topic to
Yeah.
tackle. But this morning, I realized that I actually do have a connection to war, and so I don't mind talking about that.
I also just want to share because my intent is, in full disclosure and transparency, I did feel a social obligation to acknowledge the things that are happening in our world. And because it's real, it's happening, it's impacting all of us. And I did have a sense of, am I leveraging those opportunities that are happening to do some what I call virtue signaling, just to show that I'm a responsible coda, I'm a good coda, I'm acknowledging pain and trauma that's happening in the world. And I wasn't quite sure what was true for me at the time. And so I decided against sharing because I couldn't confidently say that I simply wanted to acknowledge these incidences for a reason that feels beneficial to our community. I wasn't 100% confident, so I decided not to share. I wasn't prepared to talk about that. And that was my fear. I just want to just name that. But after the two of us had a conversation this morning, oof, I actually, why don't you start? Why don't you share a little bit more about what we talked about?
Yeah, sure. So for our audience, maybe you don't know that my mother is deaf and she's from South Korea. She was born in 1945. And if you're a history buff, you may recall that in 1945 or around soon thereafter, in 1950, the Korean War broke out, which meant that the US military had occupied South Korea to defend against an attack from the North. Okay, so the North Korea was trying to attack South Korea. And I remember my mother saying, that she remembers running through the city, holding her mom's hand, seeing bodies laying on the ground everywhere. And so that's a very traumatic experience that she remembers having very young. She's probably about 5 at that time. And the reason why I mention this is because war and all wars have an impact on people. I mean, that's a no brainer, right? Of course, war has an impact on people, but it has a serious impact on marginalized communities in particular. So, take my mother, for example. She's deaf, and at the time, the school for the deaf was located in the city Seoul, which, if you are familiar with the geography of Korea, we have the peninsula, the 38th parallel, and right Above the 38th parallel is North Korea, and below is South Korea. So, right under the 38th parallel is the city of Seoul. And so, my mother's family had been living there, but she has family on her mother's side further south along the peninsula, about 3 or 4 hours, in a town called Gwangju. And so, when the war broke out, the fighting was happening right around that 38th parallel. And people who had been living in Seoul had escaped further south because, of course, it was safer. And so my mom's family, no exception, they moved south to Gwangju to escape the war. And so the city of Gwangju has no school for the deaf.
Mm.
And the closest school for the deaf is Daegu, which is 2 hours to the east. But this is wartime. Their family isn't rich. They couldn't afford to just pick up and move to to Daegu just so that my mother would be able to go to school, right? So they were just getting by on their own. So they were living in Gwangju. And my mom was there until she was about 11, which means during the wartime, my mom didn't have access to education until the age of 11. And for any other child, like maybe that's not a big deal, right? Like you still can have a conversation with your family.
Yeah.
You can talk about topics, or, you could even go to your local school. You could
Homeschool.
be homeschooled, right? Like
Yeah.
not a big deal. But for my mom, who was deaf, this had a huge impact on her. This had a huge impact on her language, her cognitive development, her experience, and her life as a deaf person. It has a huge impact.
Absolutely.
So, why do I bring all of this up? The impact of war, this type of impact, still happens all over the world today. Not just in 1950 South Korea, but in
Right now.
2023.
Yeah.
Right now, it is still happening. War hurts everybody, but in particular, marginalized communities like deaf people. Getting access to information, knowledge, resources, um, economic resources, all of these things are scarce during wartime, but particularly scarce for marginalized communities.
I also think that it's important to talk about the fact that it is absolutely impactful on the survivor of war. But it's not just the survivor, it's also their children, it's their children's children. There's a ripple effect.
Yeah.
So I think about what your mother went through and then how that impacts you as a coda,
Mhm.
and how it impacts your relationship with your mother, your sense of responsibility and support for your mom, your access to Korean spoken language or written language. I know you've been taking Korean language classes, and I think
Mhm.
about the fact that your mother is deaf, and because she survived a war, your access to your home language was also deprived as well.
Mm. Right. There's so many layers to this.
Absolutely, and such a domino effect. So, if we look at today's situation and we already have evidence of what to expect, we can then look back to history and say, without a shadow of a doubt, we know that there are deaf people in Gaza. We know this. We know we have deaf people in Palestine. We know we have deaf people in Israel. So we already know that they are there and they exist, and they probably have children, and their children are probably hearing. So if we know that they deserve support, as deaf individuals, we can also start to prepare future support for the children who have already been born or who have not been born, who will be born after hopefully this war ends. Hopefully that's soon. But they're going to have a very serious, prolonged, and profound impact as well.
Yeah. The economic impacts alone are huge. And we know that this is tied with your ability to survive and thrive, right?
Yeah.
So, yeah, it has huge impacts. So, I mean, this is not the only war, right? I mean, prior to this, there was the, occupation of Ukraine by
Yeah.
Russia. And there have been wars prior to that. if you look at Facebook, there's an organization called Off the Grid Missions, and they do a wonderful job of
Mm-hmm.
spotlighting deaf communities in need. Um, Different places all over the world that need support. Whether that is a country that's suffering from war, or if that country, I don't know, has is targeting deaf people, or whatever the case may be. But they're in desperate need of support, and they highlight these communities. And so it's hard for us to imagine when we're living in the DMV. You feel very removed
Yeah.
from the realities of what's happening for other deaf people in the world. It's very easy for us to shut our computers off and not look and not even think about the impacts that are happening on their lives. But these people eventually, immigrate to the United States or grow up and become adults, right? And maybe one day I'll be standing face to face with one of them. I may meet them or may work with them one day. This world is small.
And the deaf world is even smaller.
Right, right. This world is very small. And so thinking about what our social obligation is to one another in the deaf community, particularly as a CODA that has a lot of privilege. I have economic privilege, education privilege. What can I do to support not only my local deaf community, but also other deaf communities worldwide?
Yeah. I really like what you said about what our social obligation is. And some of us feel stuck. We're not sure what to do. And of course, Off the Grid Missions is a wonderful organization to donate to. And we can donate time, energy, attention, learning, and we can prepare to support when the literal dust starts to settle. And so I guess my question for anyone who's watching in our audience is, what is those of you who are either deaf yourselves or CODAs and your parents have gone through this type of trauma, be it war, violence, what type of support did you need after the dust settled? I think this is something that we don't really talk about a whole lot. Just
Mhm.
what kind of things should TCN start preparing for, or our deaf community, or our CODA organizations? What are some things that we should start preparing for to support those individuals? So we can ask you, Sue, or ask other CODAs, CODA adults, young people. What kind of support would have been helpful after crisis is over?
Yeah. Well, I think it's worth mentioning that our community is very rich in, connection and care and love and support for one another. And at the same time, we're all, feeling like we're drowning with the pressures of daily life, right? Maybe not having enough support or having to do things on our own and navigate this life. And it's a lot. It's a lot. And, um, families, people who are refugees, who have had to escape their country to come here for safety, people who have immigrated here after the war is over, like they have experienced significant trauma to then arrive at a new country with absolutely zero network, zero resources. How do they even find the deaf community? How do they find the network, right? There is no sign that says deaf community
Yeah,
here,
no bulletin
you
board.
know? Yeah. And so, how is it that we can connect and support and find these people? I think this is a really important question to ask, because the only way that we can is through our networks, and by helping one another. And so, I remember when I was young, my mother had moved to Fremont, our family to Fremont, and the first place that we had gone was to the Deaf and Hard of Hearing Center in Fremont. And we moved to a city that had a Deaf and Hard of Hearing Center, because without it, well, how would we get connected to resources? And not every city has that. So this is important for us to think about is how are we leveraging our networks and supporting one another and staying connected? It's very important.
It makes me realize the value of deaf schools also. I mean, that often becomes the go to place, right? Like when you're Googling deaf, that's what's going to come up in the Google search if there's a deaf
Mm-hmm.
school in that area. And now we know that our deaf schools are starting to struggle and shut down. So I'm thinking again about the ripple effect and what that looks like. I know that there are many deaf services centers throughout the country, but again, that word that shows up in the search engine is going to be really important. Thank you
Yeah.
for
Well,
sharing.
thank you. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
if anyone else has a story to share, please include it in the comments below. And resources, if you have them, please include those. I think it's important for us to think about what happens after. All right. Thank
All
you so
right. Thank
much.
you. We'll see you all next week.
Absolutely.